Hi, my name is Mary Claire Stack, and I'm an Ursuline of Jesus. Our session today is Navigating the Way, the Gift and Art of Discernment. Our presenter is Faith Nostbakken. Faith, your parents, or whoever named you, were inspired when they said, "She will be called Faith." I know Faith as a woman of a faith that is well grounded in her Lutheran tradition, while being open to engaging with people in a whole variety of denominations. When Faith and I were together in ELARC, the Edmonton Lutheran Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue, I felt so enriched by what she shared. The depth of her insights and the transparency she evidenced in naming the moments of light and darkness in her journey. Faith's life bears witness to the one who is truth and who is desirous of letting Ruah breathe newness into her spirit, which is why over the years she has refined her understanding of discernment. It is for Faith a gift and an art, a call and response, a grace and freedom. She knows that our God is a God of mystery, and because of her profound faith, vibrant relationships with others, first and foremost herself, God and all creation, she is always willing to plumb the depth of mystery, to wait and to listen and to act on what she has come to realize to be the presence of God in her life. So please join me in warmly welcoming Faith Nostbakken.
Hello to all of you who are joining in this workshop, either as part of the 2023 Conference of Vocation and Formation Directors across Canada, or perhaps finding this workshop online at another time or from a different place. It is a privilege to have this opportunity to share some of what I have learned, taught, and continue to develop on this topic of discernment, both in my personal life and as a spiritual director, workshop presenter, and retreat facilitator. I have a broad ecumenical formation myself, drawing from both Catholic and Protestant traditions and ministering to people across a wide range of Christian denominations. I have titled this workshop, Navigating the Way, the Gift and Art of Spiritual Discernment. And in the brief description of this topic for my presentation with you, I have said, discernment is a gift and an art by which we make both daily and major life-changing decisions. Through prayer and practice, we can better attune ourselves to the invitation and guidance of the Spirit. We can then not simply make more healthy decisions, but find more grace-filled rhythms to live in relationship to others, ourselves, the world, and to God. I'd like to begin with a very appropriate prayer of discernment by St. Patrick. May the strength of God pilot us. May the power of God preserve us. May the wisdom of God instruct us. May the hand of God protect us. May the way of God direct us. May the shield of God defend us. May the host of God guard us against the snares of evil and the temptations of the world. Amen. We could spend days unpacking what navigating the way of discernment might mean. But in the course of the next hour, I'd like to emphasize not only that discernment is for both the large and smaller choices in our lives, but to engage in practices that foster healthy discernment to become freer, more grounded people of faith, open to the rhythms of God's grace, which sustain us in all that we have and all that we do. Author Elizabeth Liebert suggests discernment then is the process of intentionally becoming aware of how God is present, active, and calling us as individuals and communities so that we can respond with increasingly greater faithfulness. In decision making, self determination comes together with God's call. She also adds, discernment is more than a means to a particular decision. It is a way of life. I find that a very compelling statement. How do we make discernment not simply about particular decisions, but about a way of life? The more satisfyingly we can answer that question, the richer our experiences and our choices will be. I am reminded of the words of Isaiah chapter 30, verses 18 and 19. Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, "This is the way, walk in it." It's a passage that suggests something about God's generosity and our own freedom. So often God sets before us the option of turning to the right or to the left. So often God is less dictatorial about which path we take and more invitational, ready to walk with us as we step in this direction or opt for that one instead. When I say that, I am telling you something about my image of God. And I want to emphasize that the way we image, see, or understand God is a significant factor in how we engage in practices of discernment. If we see God as a judge, an uncompromising master, or a puppeteer managing the strings of our lives, then we will operate more out of fear than out of trust. Fear of perhaps making the wrong choice, rather than trusting that God will accompany us in the choices we carefully and prayerfully consider. Because ultimately, discernment does not bring us absolute certainty, but rather operates in a climate of faith. Seeking to follow God's call moves us towards that which is better for us individually and for our world, and assures us that God will accompany us into the unknown. As part of wrapping up these introductory comments, I'll quote Liebert again. Finally, believe that God accompanies you wherever your decisions take you. In this sense, you cannot fail discernment. A poor choice may not necessarily be a bad discernment, because discernment is not measured by outcomes, but by our increasing sensitivity to God's gracious invitations and desires for our welfare. The only ways we can fail at discernment are by stubbornly turning our back on spiritual freedom, or by deciding not to seek God's call in this situation at all. Even then, God remains with us. Grace and freedom, they get braided together in a single cord when we approach discernment as a way of life in which God is ever present, guiding, inviting, encouraging, supporting, sustaining, forming, and accompanying us. As we explore this path further, let us keep that connection of grace and freedom in our hearts and in our minds. As I move into some more specific aspects of discernment, I am quite confident that much of what I will say in this presentation you may already know. What I hope is to bring some of the knowing together in a particular shape that encourages you in the work you are already doing and helps you find ways to encourage those you are guiding and supporting in vocational life. As I talk about discernment, there are times I will use the language of we and us, other times the language of you and yours, and yet other times the language of they and them. This is not to confuse any of us, but has more to do with exactly what I am focusing on at a particular point, or the material that I am drawing on at that time, or making the language available to various people who may have access to this presentation, including those supporting others in discernment, and perhaps those of us who are also always in discernment ourselves. The direction I will take in this workshop is to focus on discernment as relationship, looking at first our relationship to God, second our relationship to ourselves, and third our relationship to others. Because together these form the dimensions of what it means that discernment is not just about a particular decision, but about a way of life. As I move through these relational dimensions of discernment, eventually I will bring us full circle to how we see discernment in vocation, addressing those crucial questions that those we support or guide may be asking. What is God calling me to? Where is God calling me to go? How do I hear that call? When we talk about how our relationship with God affects us as discerning people of faith, we can talk about the relationship between what we understand as God's will and what we recognize and acknowledge about our own desires. If we see God as honoring our freedom and therefore being a collaborator, one who co-labors with us, rather than someone who maps a specific way or judges our every step as right or wrong, then we can take seriously both God's design and our deep desires. But one of the stumbling blocks for many who want to follow God is that they are afraid of what God will ask of them. Or they acknowledge with their heads that God loves them, but do not fully accept it in their hearts. That can be a real impediment to discernment. So as we listen to people answering God's call, we really need to listen to their images of God and subsequently their understanding of God's will. Let me say a few words about God's will. It's a very biblical term. In the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, we say, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." St. Paul writes in his letter to the Colossians, "We ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of God's will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you may lead lives worthy of the Lord." Many people, therefore, are very comfortable with the language of will, but some people will find it a harsh or limiting or deliberately tricky word, as if it is one right specific thing and we might get it wrong, or it is one universal thing and its application to my life and my decisions is relatively incidental or insignificant. So for some, God's will can be a kind of harsh, boxy container. Liebert suggests it can be misleading because it implies that God's will is a thing rather than a relationship. She says, "I prefer to speak of God's call rather than God's will, for I believe that call is more reflective of the open, relational, and non-predetermined nature of God's relationship with us than the classical term will often connotes." Therefore, she adds, as we discern, we are invited to answer the question, in what way is God calling me to create through this decision which I face? Myself, I often find myself using the word invite, as in what is God inviting me or us to? But also the word call, or the word dream. What might God be dreaming for me at this juncture? Or desire. What does God desire for me in this decision? Or as Henry Nouwen speaks of God's will as the priorities, directions, and gifts from God, God's concrete ways of loving us and our world. So it is important to be aware of the effect of language and image when we consider our relationship with God as a key factor in our discernment. What will be comfortable language for some people will unsettle others, and perhaps vice versa. This leads us to considering the equation of how our relationship to God and our relationship to ourself come together. Then we also need to ask, what role does my desire play in discernment? Because this is also part of our relationship with God, and at the same time, our relationship with ourselves. This too is a word that can unsettle people if they have been taught to see desire as suspicious, as a sign of selfishness or subjective whim, which has been one of the ways our Christian tradition has taught or guided us. However, Philip Sheldrake, in his book Befriending Our Desires, begins by saying, "Desire lies at the very heart of what it is to be human. There is an energy within all of us that haunts us and can either lead us to set out on a quest for something more or frustrate us with a nostalgia for what we do not have. You could say that desire is God-given, and as such, is the key to all human spirituality. Desire is what powers our spiritualities, but at the same time, spirituality is about how we focus our desire. Consequently, we need to be in touch with how we recognize our own desires, how we value or don't value them, how we access their energy, how they relate to God's engagement with us as discerning people. Without desire, our choices will feel soulless. Desires make up our life dynamic, keeping us keenly on the lookout for new possibilities and encouraging us to take risks, letting go of the well-being of the present for the sake of the potential more being of the future. The challenge then is to discern desires that align with our deepest values from desires that are more superficial or aligned with values that don't reflect our truest selves. Liebert says, in discernment, desires are the royal road to self-knowledge. When we know our deepest desires, we know something important not only about ourselves, but also about God, as our deepest desires come from and point to that same God. I like what author Margaret Silf has done with desires in her book on Ignatian spirituality titled Inner Compass. She provides a picture or image that can encourage ways we might get in touch with our desires and distinguish the greater from the lesser, the truer from the less true. The image is that of a tree whose life force is thrust in two directions at the same time, down into the ground where it seeks water and gathers nutrients, and upward into the air with branches that seek light and warmth of the sun and the life-giving components of the air. In its downward thrust, the tree gains nourishment and a firm hold on the earth. In the upward thrust of its branches, it not only reaches for light and warmth, but also expresses its own truth and beauty as a unique being. Our desires can be considered according to this metaphor as they thrust in two directions. The desires that go deep seek nourishment and security that are at the... Okay, start again. Our desires can be considered according to this metaphor as they thrust in two directions. The desires that go deep, seeking nourishment and security, are considered root desires, and the desires that urge self-expression, spreading open our arms to the world around us and to friends and loved ones, to those things that embody light and warmth are our branch desires. Here are a few examples of the way that Margaret, okay, start again. Just give me a second. Okay, starting again. Here are a few examples, self-offers. Root desires are things such as a desire for safety and comfort, for a stable home and a peaceful world where I can be rooted. A desire for physical, mental, and spiritual nourishment. A thirst to always go deeper in friendship, in study, and in prayer. Some of the branch desires are such as these: a desire to do creative work that expresses the real me to the outside world, a desire to express to the people I most trust my deepest feelings and hopes and dreams, a desire to show compassion to someone in need. Our desires help prove to us that there is always something beyond us towards which our energy strives. Roots can always go deeper, and branches reach up higher than the sun, sky, and air, which are always beyond and out of reach. Yet it is precisely in the striving that the growth and the fruitfulness happen. It is in seeking that we are found. In some genuine way, our desires, by very definition, point beyond themselves. What many will say, self included, is that if we follow our desires to their deep hidden roots, those desires will ultimately express at their center their true source, God's desires or dreams for us. So in our relationship to God, we need to pay attention both to God's good design, we might say God's will or God's call, and our root and branch desires, prayerfully seeking how the two connect, conjoin, become one, which is where we find our greatest freedom and the greatest expression of God's grace. When we engage in discernment, then, we pay attention to our desires, knowing that not all desires are equal, or that beneath the surface desires lie deeper, more authentic desires. We pay attention to God's desire or dream or will for us, knowing sometimes that what looks like desire, okay, start again. We pay attention to God's desire or dream for us, knowing sometimes that what that looks like can seem a little murky or unclear. And that is why discernment takes time. That is why we need to be willing to engage in self-awareness, being in tune with what is going on within us. That is why we also need prayer, opening ourselves to the vulnerable place of being receptive to God's presence and God's self-revelation. That is why discernment is both a gift and an art, why it is both a process and a way of life. A very valuable way of praying that encourages discernment as a way of life is the daily examen brought to prominence by Ignatius of Loyola. Because I am sure most of you are very familiar with this prayer practice, I'm not going to focus on its form, but simply point out its fruitfulness for people choosing discernment as a way of life. As the daily examen tends to small details of each day, it cultivates a sensitivity to our interior movements, thoughts, and feelings in conjunction with our outer actions and interactions, helping us notice our conflicted desires, encouraging us to hold them up to God's grace, and inviting us to look forward and formulating desires to meet the next day's challenges. The daily examen, the awareness examen as it is called, is a good spiritual habit as we become more finely tuned to how our relationship with God connects to our relationship to ourselves and to others. Some of its richness is its emphasis on God's grace. The prayer is what we ask God to do within us, not something we can humanly achieve. At the same time, it is a way of being regularly available to God so that God's light can both heal our darkness and help us grow. Second, then, it is a prayer about love, for we are looking to find out where God's love has been active today, where God's love has been leading today, how we responded to its invitation, and what God might be calling us to tomorrow. And third, the root of the practice is desire, that word I have been reflecting on. As we pray through the details of our day, we do so with the desire to respond daily to God's love, a desire which is a gift sought in humble, trusting prayer. What this kind of daily practice does is awaken us to a holistic way of living our faith. As one contemporary source of Ignatius' approach to discernment says, Ignatius was not so much interested in creating a foolproof step-by-step manual for decision-making, but wanted to shape the kind of person who could be intuitively able to sense the spirit of the movements within her, and thereby could know God's will. He was interested, Ignatius was, in building not a process of discernment, but rather a person of discernment. This is another way of saying that discernment is most rewarding and engaging when it is not simply a way of making decisions, but a way of life. How can we support each other not simply in a primary process of discernment, but in a deeply ingrained way of becoming persons of discernment, which will shape and influence our whole way of being? The daily examen can lead to progressive clarification, seeing patterns that reveal where God is leading in our lives. It can increase our sense of trust in God and our capacity to find God in all things. This notion of being persons of discernment subtly tips into a slightly greater emphasis on our relationship to ourself. Relationship to self, though, is still not in isolation, but who we are as selves in God. From this perspective, I have found that sensitizing people to their interior movements, what Ignatius calls consolations and desolations, can be a way of fine-tuning our inner ears to the heart of God. It is not so much that we are swayed this way and that by all our feelings, but rather that our interior movements, including our feelings, provide information for us about what we value, what we fear, what stirs our anger, what spurs our hope. And this information becomes a source of divine wisdom so that we are less likely to simply react to what is going on around us and more likely to respond, which is more deliberate, thoughtful, intentional, as a way of being with ourselves and with the world. Admittedly, our various cultures may tend to be suspicious of emotion, as if feeling were unreliable, shallow, or fickle compared to logic and reason. But the more important perspective is to realize God uses all God has given us, including not only our rational minds, but our feelings as well. Liebert says, spiritual life is the passion for God expressed through our unique selves and our unique contexts. The power of emotion lies in its ability to move us to action. If we don't feel anything, we probably don't act. Faith is not itself a feeling. but it happens or exists in the context of feelings. And so Liebert adds, when we are convinced that God loves us exactly as we are, we can be about the business of integrating all our emotions into a healthy spirituality. In fact, we can't actually make sound decisions without emotions. Even the word emotion speaks of movement, as in towards motion. And someone who suffers from severe depression, for example, a flattening of emotions, finds it difficult to do anything, even just getting out of bed in the morning. Emotions are an important component of knowing and judging. The two primary interior religious affects, consolation and desolation, encompass our feelings, but include a broad spectrum of inner senses, awarenesses, and responses. Author and spiritual director Maureen Conroy identifies some of the ways we can experience spiritual consolation. She speaks of it as being close to God, right with God, experiencing joy, light, insight, freedom, quiet, self-acceptance, being relaxed, having anger appropriately expressed, prayer coming easy, abiding peace, fullness. She also speaks of love, hope, faith and trust, vivid sense of God, gratitude, oneness, faithfulness, beauty, receptivity, comfort, steadfastness, painful but necessarily healing, and true sorrow. When she speaks of spiritual desolation, some of the examples include these: feeling separate from God, as it were, dissonance, sadness, darkness, confusion, feeling stuck or immobile, knowing turmoil, feeling unloved, having self-accusation or self-berating, anxiety or tension, anger that is unexpressed, self-absorption, affectivity closed down, avoidance of pain, distraction in prayer, boredom, avoidance of prayer itself, restlessness, feeling harassed, having dryness or flatness, particularly in prayer, loneliness, feelings of hopelessness, lack of trust in God, feeling abandoned by God. We all generally experience both times of desolation and times of consolation. We go back and forth and in and out. But simply being aware of our interior movements can give us insight about how to make choices that are healthy and life-giving. For one thing, Ignatius advised, never make a decision while in consolation, start again. For one thing, Ignatius advised, never make a decision while in desolation. And while this may not necessarily mean we completely pause our discernment process in times of desolation, it does offer the wisdom of advising that we know ourselves well enough in discerning that we are clear, that we are moving towards something from a position of consolation and not simply running away from where we are from a position of desolation. We respond, as I said earlier, rather than react. As we continue to focus further on our relationship to ourselves, even as we are rooted in our relationship to God, another way of considering this self-relationship as we aspire to be discerning people is to recognize that God invites us to use all that we are, including not only our feelings, emotions, desires, and interior movements, as I have already said, but also our reason, our imagination, and our bodies as well. Let's look first at how our mind, both its imagination and its reason, can be engaged. Ignatius offers some suggestions. Clarify what you want to decide. Make it as specific as possible. The more complicated or multifaceted it is, the more difficult it is to decide. Second, pray for the grace to be at balance or equilibrium, without leaning more to one side or the other. In other words, we should try to the extent possible not to prefer one option, but to start again. In other words, we should try to the extent possible, not to prefer one option to the other, but only desire to do what God desires for us. 3, then pray for God to enlighten us according to our ultimate end or goal, which is our life in God. 4, we can use our imagination. Imagine a person you've never met seeking your help in responding to God's call in this same decision, and observe what advice you might give that person, and then follow that advice. This is helpful since most of us are better at giving advice to others than at figuring out what we need to do. We can also use our imagination in another way. Looking back at our life from the end of our life, imagine being in that position, meeting Christ. How then would you feel about your decision? Choose the course of action now that would give you the happiness or joy you would have looking back from the end of your life. When there is no inner clarity, Ignatius, start again. When there is no inner clarity, Ignatius also invites us to use our reason to weigh the matter carefully, to try to come up with a decision in line with living our lives according to what God may be calling, inviting, or encouraging us to do. And so we weigh the advantages and disadvantages and not look at it then by the number of one side versus a number on the other, but rather what stands out from the others and why, and how does this point us? This can help us move from inner confusion to greater clarity concerning the issues that need to be attended to, and to help separate out which is more significant. And then, having come to a decision, we again turn to God for confirmation. And I'm going to come back to that one in a moment, so we'll just leave that one for now. Our bodies, too, play a role, for we are embodied in all that we do. As we invite others to listen to their bodies, here are some valid questions. Do you have any sense of energy or lethargy related to the pros and cons of your decision? Do you find yourself getting very anxious, or does a sense of peace descend on you as you make your lists of pros and cons? Are you finding that your stomach tightens, your back tenses, or a headache develops, or are you filled with a sense of energy and enthusiasm? Do you notice any lightness or pain creeping into one or more areas of your body? What options seem to get your energy or creative juices flowing as you think about them? Engaging in reason, imagination, desire, feelings, and our bodies, we need to recognize that making a decision requires patience as it leads to confirmation. We must learn to read our lives for clues to help us discern God's desires and dreams for us. Just as detectives solve mysteries by paying close attention to the details of a case, we too can discover God's hope for us by observing the details of our lives, being aware of the gifts God has given us, the patterns of our lives, the dreams, awake or sleeping, the wisdom of our bodies can help us make decisions that are consistent with God's guidance in the daily choices when we make and face life decisions. God says in Isaiah, "Pay attention, come to me, listen, and your soul will live." This takes attentiveness, but it also takes patience. We might all wish that God would show up in a burning bush as God did for Moses. But if we require a burning bush, we will miss all sorts of opportunities. Instead, we need to stay engaged with God, listening, arguing if need be, but above all, not leaving God out of the process and trying to take charge ourselves. Poet Rainer Maria Rilke says, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves." As long as we keep listening for God rather than dismissing the question of God's call and making decisions without God, as long as we keep living the questions, we are exercising patience. There will be times in our discernment when the answers are clear, and times when the only answer seems to be silent. But patience in the process means that we stay in conversation with God, answers or no, and remain hopeful and confident that we will see by and by. Here I want to emphasize the importance of our relationship with others in our discernment. For part of this patience is also, of course, involving the community. We don't do discernment in a vacuum. How so? We invite those who we are supporting in discernment to read scripture, take classes, talk with others, listen to sermons, be challenged by other viewpoints to clarify which lens produces a clearer, truer image of God's leading. It is good to let people come to know their own lens and also let it be challenged by the lenses of others. Also invite reliance on discerning companions then. John of the Cross talks about, let me start again. John of the Cross emphasizes God will not bring clarification and confirmation to the truth of the heart of the one who is alone. Such a person would remain weak and cold in regard to the truth. Rather than seek a balance between listening for God's call in your quiet spaces of your own heart and pay attention to the observations and questions of others. We need spiritual community to help us stay focused on God rather than on ourselves alone. When we feel that we must keep what we are doing a secret from everyone else, we are usually following a voice other than God's. Soul friends can be helpful. What is a soul friend? It's someone who is willing to wait for God's wisdom without offering their own opinion. Someone who knows how to listen, how to ask questions rather than giving advice. Ones who don't judge, but are not afraid to ask the hard questions either. They are good observers. They look for clues that bring the whole truth into perspective, rather like detectives. And they admit they do not have all the answers. These soul friends may very well include assigned people like spiritual directors. Spiritual director is a midwife paying attention to God in helping to give birth to what is deepest in our souls. I discovered when I was making a significant life decision that I had several very important conversation partners, as well as my own spiritual director, and a very wise woman who changed my life by insisting that I also needed to have a conversation with my body. Different voices provide different sources of wisdom. When we reach the point then that we are ready to make a decision, or that the people we are guiding are ready to make their decision, the importance is to confirm it. That means, as Ignatius would say, bring it back to God and sense how God is present to that decision. It may mean trying it on in your imagination for a day or a week, and then trying on the opposite decision for a day or a week, and seeing which one resonates most profoundly. It means listening to your body, paying attention to your heart, confirming it in community. Deborah Farrington says, what you may find is that some will agree and some will disagree about your sense of call. However, if no one understands what you are sensing, it is time to wait and listen for longer. She also says, it is possible for all your friends, family, and spiritual community to be wrong about their assessment of your discernment, but it is unlikely. So then it is important to act on the decision. From the perspective of Ignatius and others who write out of his model, if you have attended with your heart, prayed with as much unattachment as possible, and confirmed your decision again in prayer and community, then you have made a good discernment with the information available to you. Over time, too, the fruits of the Spirit may result: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. When the long-term result of the action you take as the result of a discerning with your heart are these fruits, then you have probably discerned clearly. However, there is no foolproof process. It is a gift and an art that we navigate by grace. Most importantly, it is a good discernment if you have been guided by this prayer of Saint Richard of Chichester: may I know thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, and follow thee more nearly, day by day. Discernment, then, means making a discriminating choice between two or more good options, seeking the best for this moment. These choices, while personal and conditional, are set within the community of faith and honor our previous well-made decisions. Discernment does not bring us absolute certainty, but rather operates in a climate of faith. Seeking to follow God's call moves us toward that which is better for us individually and for our world, and assures us that God will accompany us into the unknown. Let me finally look at discernment from our relationship to others in the world, not simply in how others support or confirm our choices, but how discernment then leads to vocation, living our lives with and for others, returning again to that primary notion of freedom. Discernment is most certainly about vocation, yes. And for those of you engaging in this presentation, that is what the focus is all about. It is about those questions I posed near the beginning. What is God calling me to do? Where is God calling me to go? Where do I belong? Henry Nouwen tested his call to live and work in Latin America among the poor by spending a year there, and discovered it was not the right place. But it led him to become aware of his true calling among God's poor at Daybreak, the large community in Toronto for disabled people. And more than that, his final decision was not a place at all, but rather God's eternal embrace. And so he says, my broader vocation is simply to enjoy God's presence, to do God's will, and be grateful wherever I am. The question of where to live and what to do is really insignificant compared to the question of how to keep the eyes of my heart focused on the Lord. There is no such thing as the right place or the right job. I can be miserable or joyful, restless or at peace in all situations. I find myself coming back again and again to the quotation by Presbyterian minister and writer Frederick Buechner. The place God calls you to is where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. In the intersection between our gladness and the world's hunger, we discover we are living where our desire and God's desire, call, dream, or will for us come together. Woven in and through this strong sense of vocation is the word freedom, which I identified at the beginning. In Galatians 5, St. Paul writes, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit to the yoke of slavery." The paradox of discernment, when understood from the standpoint of Christian tradition, is that the freedom about which Paul speaks is certainly the precursor for making good choices, by asking God to keep us open, to free us from our disordered attachments, by desiring to be at equilibrium about the alternatives, favoring neither one or the other as we begin to discern. At the same time, paradoxically, freedom is the outcome, too, of discernment. By prayerfully attending to our choices, engaging our mind and our heart, our reason, our emotions, our bodies, and our relationships to others in the deliberations, by not rushing and not procrastinating either, but rather by patient waiting and deliberate action, we come not to certainty, but to a place of yes and no that yields a sense of peace and fosters greater trust in the one who leads and guides us, sometimes in the stillest, smallest voice, rather than all the racket of wind and fire and earthquake that sometimes precede it. I like what Elizabeth Liebert has to say in her simplicity. All that is necessary is the desire to listen for God's call in the midst of your life. That is enough. We bring our little drop of generosity, and God responds. We ask for spiritual freedom, and God assists us to grow in it. We seek what is better in a particular situation, and God meets us in that seeking. This is a measure of God's abundant grace that honors our freedom. It is important that we remember that God is a loving God who wants us to experience joy and is going to lead us to a good place where we find its fulfillment. That doesn't mean that where God leads us will be easy, or that it won't involve sacrifice and even some suffering, but it will lead to a life that matters, makes a difference, has great meaning, and involves more deep satisfaction than we could ever imagine or find in a life where we try to control everything and only follow our own self-determined plans. Any life worth living involves sacrifice and suffering. But if we are following God's call, there will be ways in which our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet, in which God's grace and our freedom come together, in which God honors who we are and challenges us to grow into a fuller, richer, more complete expression of ourselves. I offer one last quotation, which is part of the inspiration for the title of this workshop, Navigating the Way, the Gift and Art of Discernment. Holistic discernment is both an art and a gift. It is an art because we can, with practice, develop our ability to be more and more sensitive to the Spirit's movements in the whirl of our lives. Yet ultimately, it is a gift because to be aware of and moved by God's presence depends totally on grace. Human effort alone cannot make it happen. Discernment is relationship, involving our relationship to God, ourselves, and others. It is a rich, life-giving practice woven into the fabric of our lives that involves gift and art, call and response, grace and freedom. May we support others and grow into this practice ourselves, step by step, day by day, with patience and hope. I close with an adaptation of the traditional Celtic prayer. God to enfold us, God to surround us, God in our speaking, God in our thinking, God in our sleeping, God in our waking, God in our watching, God in our hoping. Amen.
Faith, thank you. You speak of yourself as a poet, a creative writer, a dancer, in addition to one who wrestles with the Word of God, that it might become flesh within and around you. Today, in what you have shared with us, we have been invited to discover new steps in our dance of discernment as women and men called to announce a God of mystery, of love and mercy, justice and peace, freedom and life in a world that cries out for hope and for a future. Thank you, Faith, for opening up to us a new sense of what the future of married life, life as a single individual, in the priesthood or consecrated life can bring to our world, so that we can become not only individually a discerning people, but a community of believers who discern and act upon the presence of God in our midst.